Welcome, and thank you for joining the World Affairs Council of Connecticut to discuss securing the 2020 election with special guest Arthur House, Cybersecurity Policy Advisor to Connecticut's Secretary of the State and Adjunct Professor at the University of Connecticut. So today we're going to kick off a conversation between Arthur House and Megan Torrey, CEO of the World Affairs Council. Arthur House is currently Cybersecurity Policy Advisor to Connecticut's Secretary of the State and Adjunct Professor at the University of Connecticut. Prior, Arthur was the Chief Cybersecurity Risk Officer for the state of Connecticut, a position he assumed after 4 years as Chairman of Connecticut's Public Utilities Regulatory Authority. Arthur has a background in national security, having served in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, in the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and as a White House Fellow on the staff of the National Security Council. Arthur consults with nations around the world from Ukraine to Rwanda, advising on issues of cybersecurity with the State Department and the National Association of Regulators of utility companies. Lastly, Arthur is also a board member and senior advisor with the World Affairs Council. And Art, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's great to be here.
And now let's get started. I'm going to turn it over to Megan Torrey, CEO of the World Affairs Council.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you everyone for joining us. Art, we are so happy to have you with us today.
Good to be back.
And and to see you, even if not in person. So I understand there's an election coming up, and it's a pretty important one. I wonder if you could, describe the nature of the election and what is at stake in November.
Well, sure, Megan. It's not a normal election. This may be the most important U.S. election that we've had since the end of World War II, because the entire international structure we set up for the world is being profoundly challenged. We've been at the center of that international system ever since we created it. Collective security, promotion of trade, monetary stability, economic development, promotion of democracy. And the US position in the world has eroded dramatically in the last 20 or 30 years. Basically, we have not had, since President George H.W. Bush, a president who was familiar with foreign affairs coming into office. From Clinton on, it has been on-the-job training. And we've had a fractured Congress regarding our position in international relations. And this process has accelerated under President Trump. Now, he's made it quite clear. He does not have placed great value on NATO. He is clearly uncomfortable with some of the elected democratic leaders of Western Europe. He does not like participation in international organizations. In fact, is right now, during a pandemic, is proceeding to withdraw from the World Health Organization. He does not like the rules of trade that we've set up. And it's clear that he feels closer to some of the world's autocrats than to some of the elected leaders. So we have to decide, the United States has to decide not just who do we want as President of the United States, but how much of that international system do we want to sustain? Do we really want to throw it all out? We want to save some of it? And the rest of the world cares enormously about what we're going to do. There's a Pew survey which is done regularly, and it's a simple question. Can you count on the United States to do the right thing? That question was asked in 2016 and around the world, and the answer was 74% said yes. That question was posed again in 2018. Now, this is before COVID. And the answer was 31%, cut in half. It's never, ever been in that range. And some of our key allies, like Germany, it was down to 13% pre-COVID. So we're in a time of huge uncertainties. If we extrapolate from this administration 4 more years, what will that bring? Well, it'll clearly bring a profound change to the international system as we know it today. How will that translate into world order? What will normalcy be? We just don't know. But Americans care about it, and unusual for this election, a lot of the rest of the world cares about it too.
Absolutely. So as we're approaching the election and having just, experienced an election that was, controversial in terms of, cyber hacking, cyber crime, cyber security. Are there real cybersecurity threats posed to the upcoming election? And if so, who's presenting these threats?
Sure, Megan. Look, the answer is emphatically yes. And I know that's controversial, but I spend time in the intelligence community. It's very rare that you have all 17 US intelligence agencies agreeing on something and agreeing in high confidence. And when they say they agree in high confidence, that's saying, I think that person robbed that store because when I walked in, he had a pistol pointed at the cashier and the money in his hand. In other words, I saw the robbery taking place. 17, and it's with high confidence. Yes, there's no question that there is meddling. Look, in 2008 and 2012, China penetrated both the Republican and Democratic parties prior to the elections. Turns out they were more interested in intelligence gathering than in affecting the outcome of the elections. In 2016, the Russians directly intervened by hacking attempts into election systems and by the use of information and misinformation. They did it again in our elections in 2018, and they're continuing to do it right now. So the short answer is yes, there are threats. And although there are several different actors, Russia is the main one. When we talk about hacking into the elections, Russia is the main nation state involved in doing that.
So can you describe what these threats are? What exactly are the threats? Can you give us a few examples?
Yeah. First of all, I think the main threat is that our election be seen to be legitimate, the outcome of it. Now, let me divide just simply into two kinds of threats. One is the information technology threat, entering voter records or voting machines, trying to mess around with the tally of votes or communicating those. And in 2016, Russia tried to enter the voting systems of 20 states, including Connecticut. They did not break into Connecticut. Our defense worked, by the way, but they tried to get into 20 states. So IT, just getting into the information technology. The second is to affect perceptions, the choices that voters make. They do that by misrepresenting election information or presenting false information. And they're trying to exacerbate tensions. They're trying to sow discord among the American public. Think of it this way, Megan. A voter expresses an opinion on social media and receives a response from Sally Jones on Long Island, who agrees and responds with 3 or 4 more reasons, more stark reasons, some of them false and some of them true, as to reinforce that view. They chat. The person likes this person and forwards the additional information to a whole bunch of friends. Now, Sally is really Vladimir Koshkin, a Russian agent based in St. Petersburg, either working for the GRU intelligence or for the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR. And there are hundreds of such Russian agents. They worked especially through Facebook. Now, many Americans find their views applauded or challenged and have great confidence in the friends they've made across the United States, never realizing that it's really not Sally, that this friendship they have is with foreign intelligence officers extrapolated and expanded exponentially. So that's just a nugget of one of the ways in which the system works.
Absolutely. So I want to remind everyone in the audience, if you have a question for Art, please use the Q&A. And please submit as many as you want. And if you want to interact with your fellow audience members, please use the chat. So Art, as we sit here, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, I wonder if, how COVID-19 is going to affect the elections. Those of us who tuned in May heard General Petraeus talk about, how we're all spending so much more time in front of our computers, that maybe, even just the frequency leaves us more vulnerable, to cyber, cyber intrusion. What are your thoughts on how COVID-19 is impacting the upcoming election?
A couple ways. One, first of all, COVID-19 has weakened us a lot. Just imagine with what we're going through right now, suppose we had a Katrina hurricane hit us. I mean, we're in absolutely no position to manage something like that with a crowded stadium and everything, or a nuclear test from North Korea or a cyber attack coming. The drama would be just much greater than normal. But COVID-19 leaves the door open to fear. Suppose you were to read on Facebook that there's a large threat of COVID-19 for going to vote at your polling place. You're going to vote in West Hartford, but you just see it on Facebook. Don't go to West Hartford voting places because COVID-19 is clearly rampant there and you'd be risking your life if you go there. Well, that's the sort of fear that is hard to counter. We've already had the president announce without any evidence that voting by mail will increase fraud. Well, that's just not so. It's the norm in many states. I mean, the Washington Post did an analysis of elections in 2016, 2018, and found that 1 in every 39,000 vote by mail ballots had some question of fraud. I mean, which is a fraction of 1%. So you've got COVID-19 enhancing anxiety, but it also affirms the dangerous and surprising suggestion, which is openly being discussed, that comes from the president, that the election process will be rigged. And, you know, this is the first time in my lifetime that we've a serious question as to whether the outcome of the election will be seen as legitimate. And if the incumbent loses, will the incumbent accept that outcome? It's always been assumed that that would be the case, but you know, anything goes nowadays, and we're not sure of what that outcome might be.
So we have had, you know, a primary season and during COVID-19. What have we learned from those primaries that have been held so far? You know, for example, in Georgia and Kentucky, Wisconsin. How are we preparing based on those examples?
Well, first of all, people care an awful lot about this election. The public has rallied even in primaries. They care. So we have to foresee an unusually large turnout. A second point is that voting in person at a machine has been a problem, even in primary elections that normally have fewer voters. In Georgia, the Secretary of the State had big problems with Fulton County, which is a heavy African-American voting area, had very, very long delays, which raises the question, when you reduce the number of voting places in certain areas, if they're Republican or Democrat, are you affecting the outcome, Republican or Democrat, in those areas? Fewer than 60,000 Republicans cast their ballot by mail in Georgia, despite having a majority of Republican voters. Now, this raises the interesting question. When the president claims that voting by mail is given to fraud, there's an article in the Washington Post just this morning. Does that mean that supporters will be more fearful of voting by mail? Will that reduce the voting for the president? Because he says, and his own backers say, and the data from Georgia suggests very striking. It's a majority Republican state, and 60,000 fewer Republicans voted by mail. Is that because they feared fraud? We don't know. Wisconsin, you had a fight between a Republican-led legislature and a Democratic governor. The Democratic governor sought to delay the election, and voters stood in line for up to 4 hours. They were in the rain, and there were more than 70 cases of COVID-19 from people traced to standing in line at the elections. So COVID-19 in the election, that does raise questions. With a lot of interest, are you going to have enough voting places? Are you going to expedite it? And will voting by mail be possible? In Kentucky, it worked a lot better. June 23, there was bipartisan cooperation in supporting the primary. A lot of upfront planning. There was massive consolidation of some voting places. In fact, there was just one voting location in each of the state's 2 largest counties, Jefferson and Fayette. But note that in Kentucky, 90% of the Democrats voted by mail and 80% of Republicans. And we don't see this here in the East, but in a lot of states, especially out West, voting by mail is normal. When my sister in Colorado thinks of voting, she looks for her envelope and the stamp. That's how you vote. That's the normal way of voting. Fill out a form, put it in the mail, and vote. We don't think of it that way here, but that whole system of voting by mail will probably be tested. Still, there were long lines in all these states. People want to vote. The poll just came out, ABC Washington said 80% of Democrats think it should be easier to vote by mail versus 33% of Republicans. That's unhealthy. We do not want one party saying this is a safe way to vote and the other party saying no, it's not. That's historically in the United States, we've all agreed that the way we vote and the outcome of the vote is legitimate. And right now we see a division, and that's not healthy at all.
So what are we doing here in Connecticut? I know you're advising Secretary of the State, Denise Merrill, on the upcoming election. What are we doing in Connecticut to defend ourselves against cyber intrusion?
Well, on the technical front, we're stronger than we have ever been. In 2016, the thought of a foreign power intruding in our election was almost fantasy, but it happened and our defenses worked. Well, now we're ready. Back then, we had defenses and it turns out they worked, but it's not that we were cognizant of it and on guard for it. And secondly, the Secretary of the State and the Connecticut Military Department are right now out working with our municipalities and cities to audit the elections process, to check for vulnerabilities, to make sure that their cyber systems work. Now, we're never 100% safe, but we are making ourselves safer. The unknown, Megan, is that will we have vote by mail? We do have vote by mail for the primaries, but the governor's executive powers, emergency powers, lapse in September. So in order for Connecticut to vote by mail in November, the legislature is going to have to enact enabling legislation over the summer to have that take place. And that could be significant. We'll see how it comes out.
So I'm gonna incorporate a few audience questions. Someone in the audience wants to know what can we as individuals do to sort of recognize when we see this misinformation, disinformation online? How do we know?
Well, first of all, be skeptical. We Americans tend to be very, very trusting. I mean, we put on Facebook everything about ourselves, where we go to church, where our kids go to school, what clubs we belong to, what our teams are. I mean, we open ourselves up to somebody coming in and say, hey, I'm a Red Sox fan too. And did you know, my daughter went to the same school that yours did. And by the way, here's some great information for me. Now that's available to Vladimir in St. Petersburg, openly. Be skeptical. When you get a political message, ask yourself where it is from. Try to verify who it comes from. And well, the obvious point also is to be sure to vote. I mean, just to cast your ballot, however you're going to do it. The third would be to dig in, try to learn what the issues really are. There is a difference. I know our news media is declining, but there are reliable sources of information. Find out what they are for whatever your political persuasion, conservative or liberal. Not all things that come over the internet are of the same importance. Senator Moynihan used to say that everyone is entitled to his or her own opinion. That's fine. But you're not all entitled to your own facts. And right now we have the dangerous situation where we have people passionately believe that things which are demonstrably false are true. And what someone could do would be to try to dig a little deeper and find out, challenge their own beliefs, look for evidence to persuade themselves that what we think is true, and don't communicate and spread information from somebody when you have absolutely no verification that they are who they pretend to be.
So another audience question. You mentioned your concern about both the importance of holding a fair election and the perception afterward that it is fair. How confident are you that our intelligence community can and will rise to the occasion to ensure an outcome?
Well, military more than intelligence, Megan. This is not a good year to repeat our experience of the year 2000. In which we had hanging chads in Florida's outcome was it was disputed right to the end, and we didn't know who our next president was going to be for a couple of weeks. We do not need something like that in this year. This is the worst possible year to have a close election. But in a sense, suppose we did. I don't think we would look to the intelligence community, but while there has never ever been doubt if we had a disputed election, what would happen? Al Gore said, okay, Supreme Court's decided this, I'll step aside. George W. Bush, you're the next president of the United States. that's rare in world history, and that bespeaks fidelity to the Constitution. Now, I think that General Mattis, in his recent, very provocative and controversial reminder to the country that our all of us, I mean, I say all of us, all office holders, military, civilian, and so forth, have sworn an oath to defend the Constitution, not an individual. So I hope if we had a contested election, and there were, it's hard to imagine this, but a lot of other things we couldn't imagine are taking place. Suppose you had a close election, the president said, I'm not leaving, there was fraud. What's things he said in the past? Hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants voted, and the voting system was rigged and this, that, therefore I'm staying. Intelligence would not have a role in verifying that. But I do think that for the first time, we might have to depend on the military to say the outcome of the election as certified is the following, and therefore there will be a transition of power. I mean, that's outlandish thinking, but strange things are happening.
So another question about, you spoke a lot about Russia and China potentially being actors in, cyber intrusion in our election. Bob wants to know, what other countries may be involved? And are you concerned that there may be rogue actors within the United States that are working to hack the election?
Yes, I am. I am afraid of both foreign powers and of rogue in the United States. One of the key points, however, is that in order to penetrate a number of systems, each state is different, and that's good. The fact that penetrating and getting into election systems themselves, we've got 50 of them, that takes massive resources and a very, very clever system, and therefore, if one were to try to do it, you'd have a much greater chance of pulling it off if you were a nation state than if you were a rogue actor. Secondly, you've got some countries which have good experience in this. The Russians have done this. They've had a couple of dry runs. They know a lot about our state systems. They're equipped to do it. They have the personnel to do it and the motivation to do it. So that's why we fear them most. But absolutely, North Korea, Iran, other actors, there are cyber experts, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. I call them cyber mercenaries who are there available to be hired. And they could get in and do some damage, yes, of course, as could rogue actors in the United States. But I come back to the fact that to have an across the boards significant impact, it would take probably the resources of a nation state to do that extensively.
So there's a few questions about voting machines in different states and are different voting systems, machines, I guess, whatever states are using, are there ones that you have seen that are more vulnerable to hacking? How are the ones that Connecticut is using? And as a follow-up to that, because of this sort of decentralized election system, each state has their own, does that improve security, cybersecurity for the election?
Well, on the first one, the main distinction is, do you have a backup paper ballot system or not? Connecticut does. When you vote by machine in Connecticut, you come into a voting place, they give you a paper ballot and you mark X, you fill in the space next to the candidate. You feed that into the machine. Should there be a cyber glitch or any other interruption in Connecticut, all else fails, you go back, pull out those things and just vote, copy them, count them in front of a group of people from both parties to agree on the outcome. So are there paper ballots fed into a machine? That's the huge differentiation. Sure, there are only a couple of manufacturers of voting machines in the United States. So it's not as though this company makes a better one than that company. There are very few companies. The question is, are they newer machines? Are the personnel trained? Have you reviewed it? Because a lot of times these things get locked up, for 11 months and 2 weeks. And then they're brought out of mothballs, plugged in, checked, and run again. Well, you want to make sure that everything's running well, that your backup systems are there, and that the people who are going to run the machines are fully aware of all the things that could go wrong and how to protect against them. And that's what we're doing right now in Connecticut. the Connecticut Military Department that's out there working with the municipalities to make sure that people are trained and know what they're going to do. Decentralization, yes, it's a huge strength. When you think about running a nation of over 300 million people, I don't think you could, given all the cultural, political, economic differences that we have, I don't think you'd ever do it by direct rule. So sometimes it's cumbersome to have 50 states all going in their different ways, but when it comes to election security, absolutely, that is a strength. Now, if you come to the handful of states that are going to determine the outcome of the election, let's say 10 or fewer states, which will determine how this is going to come out. The rest of them, we know how they're going to vote. That kind of reduces that from 50 to at least there are 10 different states where the outcome is in doubt. But yes, decentralization certainly is a strength.
So we're running out of time, but I want to ask you to end with, what are the most important things we should be aware of as we approach the 2020 election? What should we be thinking of and what should we be doing?
Well, as a member of the World Affairs Council of Connecticut, I guess I would just add that in addition to whatever your policy preferences are nationally and personally, realize also that this is an election that affects the world a lot. And we need to change the international order that we created after World War II. It's outmoded. It needs to be changed. Is the way in which it is being currently changed by this administration good, bad, positive? Or would you amend it by a different way? Make up your mind on that one. But I would just simply interject that most people rarely vote unless there's a war going on foreign affairs matters. This year, that is a pertinent issue to consider. Secondly, I mean, be sure you vote, and your family and friends. I mean, this is not a year in which you say, I think I'll go on vacation, or I'm too busy, or whatever. You are not too busy. This is a year in which election is extremely important. Be sure to vote. I hope that there is not going to be that choice of personal safety versus voting. That would be wrong. And I hope that we will have a vote by mail system, that people will be able to use it and exercise it, that how it happens will be clearly communicated. And so that those that have anxiety about going to the polls will have it reduced. For the polls, we will have voting by machines. And I just hope that everybody, we need poll workers in Connecticut. There's one thing that people can do is to sign up to be a poll worker. But go down there, maintain the 6 feet apart, wear a mask, in and out, but keep it safe and do vote. So I guess I would just say, get involved. This is not an election in which we take either the issues or the outcome for granted or the process for granted. All that is challenged in ways we haven't seen before. So be a good, whatever, I was going to say Democrat, what I meant with that was a small d, participant in the democratic process. And make sure you do vote.
All right, thank you so much for joining us today. I look forward to the time when we get to see you again in person. Thank you for everything you do for the World Affairs Council of Connecticut.
Oh, it's great. It's great to be with you. Thanks very much, Megan.
Thank you so much. That was a fantastic conversation. And thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you can join us next week. Again, we can share that next Wednesday, July 15th, again from noon to 12:30. We'll be hosting Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, to discuss Saudi Arabia and U.S. policy in the Middle East. So we hope you can join us next week as well. In the meantime, thank you so much for being involved. Thank you, Art, so much for joining us today. As always, our last plug is to, if you'd like to revisit this conversation, check out anything you missed or share it with some of your colleagues or friends as a source of trusted information on social media to positively influence the democratic process. You can do so by visiting our YouTube channel, which is World Affairs Council of Connecticut on YouTube. Please subscribe and share this with your friends. Again, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.